All right, well, it's Marlon Schmidt here, the MLA for Edmonton Gold Bar. We're trying something new today. It's a live reaction video, and I thought I would start off with a live reaction to these Alberta Next Panel videos that the government of Alberta has put out. The separation that isn't really about separation tour that the Premier is launching. I've heard a lot about, I've heard the government radio ads telling me to watch these videos. I've heard people who are outraged about them telling me to watch these videos. I have yet to watch the videos. So you're going to watch me watch these videos and see my reaction live, and let's have a good time doing it. So we're going to start with the video titled, "Should Alberta Lead on Constitutional Reform to Better Protect Provincial Rights Across Canada?" Awesome. Let's get it started.
The Alberta Next Panel is touring Alberta to hear from Albertans on how our province can better protect ourselves from Ottawa's economic attacks, while building a more prosperous, strong, and sovereign Alberta within Canada.
Okay, so first response here, sovereign. What does that mean? Danielle Smith has talked about a sovereign Alberta for a couple of years now, and she's never really clarified what that means. As a province, we can't be sovereign, right? We are subject to the laws of Canada. If we want to be a sovereign Alberta, that necessarily means being independent from Canada. We cannot have it both ways. But it seems that the Premier wants to have it both ways, that we follow the laws of Canada that we like, and we don't follow the laws of Canada that we don't like, and that's her definition of sovereignty. And I think that people understand that that's not workable.
A provincial referendum on some of these ideas is coming in 2026. But what's on that referendum ballot and what happens next for Alberta is up to you.
Okay, stop it right there. This is patently false. What is on the provincial referendum is not up to Albertans. We get to have some input into what's going to be on the provincial referendum, but what is actually the question is up to the Premier and to Cabinet to decide. If you read the legislation that they passed, it is absolutely the Premier and the Cabinet's final say as to what the provincial referendum questions will be. It's not your or my decision. And so this is a patently false statement that this video is making. Don't be fooled. The questions that the people of Alberta will be asked on the provincial referendum in 2026 will be formed by Danielle Smith and her cabinet, not us.
One idea being discussed by the panel is Alberta taking a lead role in working with other provinces to pressure the federal government to amend the Canadian Constitution to empower and better protect provincial rights.
Okay, so the question is whether or not Alberta should take a lead role in pressuring the federal government to amend the Constitution. So a couple of things about that. First of all, I think it's interesting that Alberta now wants to take a lead role in doing this because, hey, I'm old enough to remember when Quebec was the province that was taking the lead role in pressuring the government to amend the Constitution, and Albertans hated that. We still have huge resentment towards the province of Quebec. 45 years after they started taking the lead in pressuring the federal government to amend the Constitution. So I don't know, Danielle Smith now wants, I guess, Albertans to be the most hated Canadians in Confederation. I don't understand why she thinks that this would be a good thing for Alberta. Listen, the Constitution doesn't work perfectly for any province in the country, and that's why it's a continued source of friction. But I don't understand why the Premier wants Alberta to lead the charge and alienate our fellow Canadians by doing this. But maybe we'll find out here later in the video. A beautiful picture of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, of course. Fun fact for a lot of people who are too young to know this or maybe have forgotten, but it was the first Prime Minister Trudeau who brought in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Conservatives were dead set against it. It's just an interesting twist of history that now Danielle Smith is wrapping herself in a document that her predecessors fought so hard against.
The Canadian Constitution, including its Charter of Rights of Freedoms and sections on the division of powers between the federal and provincial governments, is foundational to our democracy. The enforcement of the Constitution by governments and the courts ensures our rights and freedoms are protected, and that our provincial and federal governments generally function as they should. But no document is perfect. Some things that made sense 150 years ago may no longer make sense today. That is why the Constitution contains an amending formula that permits the Constitution to be altered should enough provinces and the federal government agree to it. Over the last decades, several outdated and unfair problems with the Constitution have been identified, but no tangible progress has been made to fix them, due primarily to a lack of federal and provincial leadership. Examples of proposed constitution.
I cut this off before we got into the examples that Danielle Smith wanted to talk to us about, but I remember very clearly the Charlottetown and Meech Lake Accords that were brought to the people in the late 80s and early 90s, and the people of Canada voted against those constitutional changes. And like Brian Mulroney's career was completely trashed because he failed to implement those constitutional reforms that he invested a lot of his political capital in. So, this is a lot of revisionist history going on, saying that the federal and provincial governments weren't leaders in constitutional reforms in the past. Brian Mulroney expended a lot of his effort into changing the Constitution and failed. It's not for lack of trying, it's just that the people are not really interested in amending the Constitution, or they certainly weren't in 1988 and 1993. Let's see what kind of examples Danielle Smith has for us here.
1. Amending the division of powers to indicate that core areas of provincial jurisdiction, including over natural resources and health, are immune from federal legislation, and to also ensure that in shared areas of jurisdiction, such as agriculture and immigration.
Wow, okay. So, Danielle Smith is proposing two things here that have significant implications for the rest of the country, should those be proposed. And maybe just back it up a little bit so that we have those on the screen. But proposing to clearly delineate the powers of the province and the federal of the province and make them immune to changes from the federal government in terms of natural resources and healthcare are really, really big and potentially very destructive. I want to start with natural resources first. So this is an area of jurisdiction where the province and the federal government share responsibilities. And rightly so, because the extraction of natural resources affects more than just the people of Alberta. We benefit a lot, and we also bear a lot of the costs of those decisions. But we're not the only ones who benefit and share the costs of those decisions, right? The extraction of natural resources provides benefits and costs to everybody in Canada. Now, whether that's a person from Newfoundland who is moving to Alberta to work in the oil sands, or if it's somebody who's living in the Northwest Territories or Saskatchewan who's downstream of Alberta's natural resource development and potentially drinking the water or breathing in the air. Like, all Canadians have an interest in how Alberta regulates its natural resource extraction. And that will always be the case. Even if we were to separate and become an independent country, then we would have to have international treaties with people who are downstream of us in terms of the impacts of natural energy extraction. So, if you don't think about it, getting Ottawa off our back in terms of natural resource energy seems like an appealing idea. But once you start thinking about how difficult it is to keep everybody happy, and how much more difficult that would be if we were to become an independent country. I think you will conclude that the current system is probably better than any future state that we could come up with. The second thing is about healthcare. And now, the government of Canada has a very hands-off role in terms of providing healthcare to the people of Alberta. They give us money, which has to be spent on healthcare, and they have the Canadian healthcare legislation. And I am really embarrassed that I cannot remember the name of that right now. But it basically provides for a standard of service that every Canadian can expect to receive from their healthcare system, whether they live in British Columbia or Newfoundland or anywhere in between. Why would Danielle Smith want to eliminate those standards and tell the government of Canada to take their money and stick it somewhere else? That doesn't make sense, and will only end up with worse health care in the province if the government pursues this line of thinking.
Indicate that core areas of provincial jurisdiction, including over natural resources and health, are immune from federal legislation, and to also ensure that in shared areas of jurisdiction, such as agriculture and immigration.
Okay. Back that up for a second, because this is also an area where provincial laws prevailing over federal ones is reversing the impact of the intent of the Constitution. The idea of having a federal government and a provincial government is that if the provincial and the federal governments disagree, that the federal government prevails over the provincial government. That's the fundamental structure of our Constitution. And what Danielle Smith is trying to do is reverse that. And, I don't think that we would want to live in a country where the provincial governments would have laws that take precedence over the federal government in terms of shared jurisdiction. For example, let's look at agriculture for one. We would want to have a common set of agricultural, transporting agricultural goods across borders, right, for example. Alberta has to transport grain and beef to BC and out east in order to get those things to market. Well, we wouldn't want the province of BC saying, your agricultural products have to meet our standards, otherwise they can't be transported through the province. But that's exactly what Danielle Smith is asking for here, is to hand over the power of regulating possibly the transport of agricultural products to provinces like BC and Manitoba. And, that won't work. We need a common set of standards, and that's why we have a federal government, is to enforce those things. And reversing the precedents, to give the provinces the precedence over the federal government, is a huge mistake and would cause so much more fighting than the current system.
Laws prevail over federal ones. 2. Imposing constitutional limits on the federal spending power in areas of provincial jurisdiction, including a provincial right to opt out of federal spending measures with proper compensation should they so choose.
Okay. Oh my God. Asking for a federal cap on spending is completely insane. That's like asking, that's like a kid asking their parents to stop spending so much on them. Who would want that? If the federal government came to us and said, we want to spend more money on health care, on building roads and bridges, or giving you money to make better libraries or internet connection or whatever, what sane province would say, no, please don't spend your money here? That's that's ridiculous. And it also, for as long as I've been alive, every Conservative premier has whined about how little government money they get from the federal government compared to other provinces. And now here Danielle Smith is saying, no thanks, we've got too much government money. It doesn't make sense. Listen, I honestly think that the federal government doesn't spend enough money on the provision of services and goods in the province of Alberta. I think that we should get more from the government of Canada to provide better health care, to provide better social services, to build better housing, right? To make life more affordable here in Alberta. It shouldn't be up to just the people of Alberta to do that. And Danielle Smith is saying no thanks. Keep your money in your pocket. That's crazy. The other thing, she wants to opt out of spending programs. Well, first of all, the government has already done that on a couple of key things, and pharmacare is the big example, right? The federal government came up with a program to provide diabetes medication to diabetics under a federal pharmacare program, and the provincial government said no thank you. We want to make sure that people who don't already have insurance to cover the cost of those medications can't get them. And so now Danielle Smith is asking for more of that, to opt out of these other federal programs. Albertans will be worse off if Danielle Smith gets her way.
Adhering strictly to representation by population in the House of Commons. Right now, those living in smaller provinces are greatly overrepresented when compared to those living in larger ones.
Representation by population, fantastic. Danielle Smith, I'm 100% in favor of this, and in fact, I want to make sure that the boundaries that you redraw in the for the next provincial election also follow that rule. Because right now, Edmontonians and Calgarians' voices are drowned out by rural Albertans, because the average urban MLA represents way more people than the average rural MLA. That's not fair, and I certainly hope that Danielle Smith takes her own prescription for a healthy democracy when she redraws the provincial electoral boundaries.
4. Either abolishing the Senate entirely or having it actually represent provincial interests as originally intended, by mandating an elected Senate with the same amount of senators representing each province.
Okay, two things. The Senate has been a hobby horse that Conservatives have been riding for as long as I've been alive. And in fact, Stephen Harper even asked the Supreme Court about the mechanics of electing a Senate or abolishing the Senate, and was told that it wouldn't be possible. So I don't know why Danielle Smith can't take no for an answer on the Senate, but it's a good thing that the Senate isn't elected. And here's why. Because if you look at the United States as an example of a government that can't get things done, it's the perfect example because they have two equally powerful branches of the legislative branch of government, right? The Senate and the House always fight, and what comes out is an alternative, is an answer that's suitably terrible for both houses. We don't want that in Canada. And in fact, if you want to create a federal government that works even worse than now, then an elected Senate is the way to go. Listen, I'm in favor of abolishing the Senate, and I will be in favor of abolishing the Senate until such time that the Prime Minister wants to appoint me to the Senate. Listen, but I think that's the least objectionable alternative given our current Constitution, and we should not mess around with the structure of the Senate.
With the same amount of senators representing each province. 5. Allowing provinces to appoint their own King's Bench and Court of Appeal justices, rather than having those appointments made by the federal government.
Okay, appointing federal judges or appointing King's Bench judges provincially rather than federally. Listen, Danielle Smith is clearly trying to grab power with respect to the administration of justice in the province. We see it in the construction of an Alberta-specific police force. Now she's pushing for appointing judges, and guys like Ted Morton, who are longtime advocates for this and who've clearly influenced Danielle Smith's thinking on this topic, have long said that they think that the federal government appoints too many socialist woke judges, and that if this were the case, then we could get some real conservative hardliners on the bench. This is simply Danielle Smith and Conservatives being upset that they don't get to appoint these judges and get to pull the strings of the justice system. The current judicial system in Alberta is outstanding in terms of the fact that judges are really independent and non-political. I think that this is a move to just politicize judges and appoint the people who will make the rulings that Danielle Smith sees fit. We certainly see that system in place in the United States. We can see its failings. I don't know why Danielle Smith wants to impose that on the people of Alberta, but that's what she's pushing for here.
6. Expanding the Supreme Court to allow for more justices from Western Canada and making prior service on a province's Court of Appeal a mandatory requirement of becoming a Supreme Court justice.
Just a note, Conservatives always talk about merit-based appointments. They don't want people appointed to positions based on their identity, and yet here they are saying that we need to have somebody from Western Canada appointed to the Supreme Court. Listen, pick a lane, guys. Do you want people appointed by merit, or do you want people appointed based on their identity? Because you can't have it both ways.
7. Eliminating the Ottawa residency requirement for judges on federal courts to ensure more Western Canadian representation. And 8. Mandating provincial approval of the appointment of a lieutenant governor to a province by the federal government. There are, of course...
Oh my God. Okay. This is clearly just picking a fight about something that does not matter. Listen, I love the lieutenant governor. I think she's a wonderful person who brings an air of dignity and gravitas to the ceremonies that she engages in. But she doesn't have any real power, right? There is nothing that the government of Alberta can do that is prevented or hampered in any way by the action of the lieutenant governor. So what's wrong with appointing them from the federal government? I don't know why Danielle Smith wants to waste her time with these kind of ceremonial decisions rather than dealing with the real issues that Albertans are dealing with. Never once in my 10 years of elected office has a constituent of Edmonton Gold Bar said, I think the province should appoint a lieutenant governor. In fact, most people, I don't think, even know who the lieutenant governor is or what they do. This is just a colossal waste of time.
There are, of course, many other potential constitutional amendments that are worth discussion, but this is a start. So, should Alberta take a lead role in working with other provinces to pressure the federal government to amend the Canadian Constitution in order to empower and better protect provincial rights? And if so, which of the amendments discussed or other proposals should the Alberta government advocate for? For more information, visit alberta.ca/next.
Well, that's the end of the video. Obviously, we see a lot of these old right-wing hobby horses being ridden again. And it's also interesting to me that some potential constitutional amendments that would actually make for better lives for the people of Alberta and for the people of Canada aren't on offer. I think of the right to a clean environment. That's not currently in the Constitution, but I think people would benefit from that. making sure that their water is clean to drink, that the air is clean to breathe, that we're not dying because of heat exposure and forest fire smoke due to climate change. Like, there's a constitutional amendment that I would like to see, but that's not something that Danielle Smith is proposing in this video, and I know that she wouldn't allow that question to be asked to the people of Alberta. Yeah, listen, I was a kid at the time, but the constitutional wrangling that occupied Canada in the 80s and early 90s really distracted from moving Canada forward in terms of actually benefiting the people of this country. We have serious problems to deal with. We have a crumbling healthcare system. We have an affordability crisis. We have a productivity, an economy that seems to be stagnating and is under threat from the government of the United States. And Danielle Smith wants to waste Albertans and Canadians' time fighting over the Constitution. I honestly think that it would be so destructive. I think it would weaken us in the eyes of the Americans and make us more easily subject to the predations of Donald Trump. And it would certainly take the time and attention that the federal and the provincial governments need to be spending in making our lives better. And so I'm so upset that this is the thing that Danielle Smith thinks it's important. It's not. The people of Edmonton Gold Bar tell me all the time that they want to see material improvements in their day-to-day lives. They don't want to have these expensive, hugely time-wasting fights over the Constitution. So that's my reaction to this ridiculous video. We'll be doing one for each of the other videos that the Alberta Next Panel is putting out. I'm interested to see if I'll be equally frustrated, more frustrated as we go along, but there you go. That's my hot take on this video. Thanks for watching.